It was just after 7:30 a.m. at the Naval Special Warfare Command Center in Coronado, California. The morning sun hit the polished steel gates, reflecting off the glass walls of the security checkpoint. Inside, the hum of computers mixed with the rhythmic beeping of biometric scanners. Masters-at-arms stood watch, M18 pistols holstered tight, their posture as straight as the flagpole outside. Captain Ryan Evans, the base security officer, adjusted his uniform collar and scanned the line of personnel waiting for clearance. He liked order, structure, and the feeling of authority that came with standing in this room. To him, this gate was his domain, a small kingdom where he held absolute control. The line moved smoothly until she appeared. A woman in plain fatigues stepped forward, her uniform clean but unadorned. No name tape, no insignia, no unit patch. Her dark hair was tied back tight, her boots standard issue but worn from use. Evans frowned. Civilians didn't wear fatigues here. Dependents didn't walk through this gate alone. He assumed she had taken a wrong turn somewhere. Maybe one of those staff officers' daughters trying to impress someone. His voice carried across the checkpoint, calm but lined with condescension, as he directed her toward the visitor's entrance near the gift shop. She didn't move. She stood still, hands resting loosely at her sides, eyes focused on the red light of the access turnstile ahead of her. The air seemed to thicken. Junior sailors waiting nearby exchanged uncertain glances. Sensing something unspoken between them, Evans misread her silence as confusion, even disrespect. He puffed up slightly, straightening his shoulders, filling the space with his presence, but her calm didn't break. There was no nervous fidgeting, no apology, only composure. The hum of the electronics and the steady tapping of boots on tile filled the silence. The woman blinked slowly, once, then shifted her weight just enough to stay balanced, like someone trained to stand still for long stretches. Her eyes, cool and unreadable, flicked briefly toward the armed guards, the overhead cameras, and the exits. Every motion was small but deliberate. The masters-at-arms by the door avoided eye contact, unsure whether to step in. Evans mistook their hesitation as support. He leaned forward, voice clipped and sharp now, telling her again that this was a restricted area and she needed to turn around. Still, she didn't answer. Her stillness seemed to unsettle him more than any defiance could have. The silence stretched, pressing against the sterile walls until even the hum of the air conditioning felt loud. No one else spoke. Everyone could feel the weight of it, arrogance, meeting quiet certainty, though no one yet understood who was standing in front of him. The silence between them felt like a drawn-out breath that refused to end. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. Her stance was balanced, her shoulders loose, her breathing slow, and even every part of her posture spoke of control. Her right thumb rested lightly over her index finger, a position that would mean nothing to most people, but everything to someone trained to shoot. It was the natural resting position of a marksman, the body's quiet memory of precision. She wasn't fidgeting or nervous. She was waiting, measuring, assessing. Evans mistook the calm for hesitation. He stepped closer, irritation showing in the small movements of his jaw. He thought she was intimidated, that his tone had cowed her into silence. But her quiet was not fear. It was discipline. Her stillness drew more attention than shouting ever could. The junior sailors nearby shifted their weight, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. Their glances bounced between the captain's tight shoulders and the woman's motionless figure. The authority in the room no longer came from Evans's rank, but from her composure. She didn't watch him directly. Her eyes moved with purpose, mapping her surroundings in silent geometry. She noted the security cameras above, the mirrored surface of the entry desk, the pattern of the floor tiles leading to the exits. She cataloged every possible route, every reflection, every sound. Her breathing stayed measured, calm in the rhythm of a trained operator's mental checklist. The air between them thickened as Evans's confidence began to crumble. The longer she stood without speaking, the smaller his words seemed. He squared his shoulders and raised his voice again, trying to reclaim control, but it only echoed against the walls. His authority sounded loud but hollow. She remained steady, her silence heavy enough to fill the space. The room itself seemed to bend around that quiet strength, as if it understood what Evans did not. This was not submission. It was restraint, the kind that precedes precision, the kind that comes just before everything changes. Inside the command observation deck, Admiral James Thorne paused mid-briefing. The hum of computers filled the room, a constant undercurrent beneath the low voices of staff officers discussing satellite telemetry through the thick, reinforced glass overlooking the main security checkpoint. Something caught his attention. The Admiral's gaze narrowed, not on the commotion or the raised posture of Captain Ryan Evans, but on the still figure standing in front of him. The woman in plain fatigues stood completely at ease, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her thumb resting across her index finger. To anyone else, it meant nothing. To Thorne, it spoke volumes. He had seen that posture before, years ago, in places that didn't exist on maps. Men and women who stood that way were cut from a different kind of cloth. They were operators who conserved energy until the exact moment action was required. They didn't twitch, didn't pace it, didn't need to fill silence. They were still because stillness was power. Thorne's mind drifted to memory the briefing tents in Bagram, the smell of dust and cordite, the faces of warriors who never hesitated when the world turned to chaos. The feeling that moved through him now was the same quiet certainty he had felt before missions that changed everything. He leaned slightly forward, studying her more closely. Evans's sharp gestures and raised voice seemed almost childish from this distance. Thorne saw the truth immediately. The woman wasn't lost or insubordinate. She was composed, alert, assessing. His instincts told him she was one of theirs. Someone trained for environments where a single breath or movement could decide survival. The Admiral didn't need to read a file to know he was looking at experience. It was written in her silence, in the economy of her motion, and in the discipline that wrapped around her like armor. Evans's patience finally snapped. The sound of his boots echoed on the polished floor as he closed the distance between them. His jaw set, his authority fraying. He grabbed the woman by the arm, his grip firm and territorial, and began steering her toward a side corridor. The sailors near the checkpoint stepped aside quickly, pretending not to notice. The hallway led to a small, steel door marked Auxiliary Debrief Room. It was the kind of place used for private reprimands and security interviews. A gray, windowless space meant to remind people who was in charge. The air inside smelled faintly of disinfectant and recycled air. Evans shut the door behind them, the metallic click sounding louder than it should have. He turned toward her, his voice lower now, colder, each word clipped by irritation. He demanded to know who she was and what she thought she was doing, trying to access a restricted area without authorization. The woman remained still, her posture unchanged. When she spoke, her voice was calm and even, the kind of voice used by someone who measures every word. She identified herself as Lieutenant Sarah Keene, but nothing more. Evans stared for a moment, then let out a short laugh that had no humor in it. A lieutenant. He told her there were dozens of lieutenants on this base, and he knew them all. And she wasn't one of them. He accused her of bluffing, of trying to name-drop her way into an area she didn't belong. The tension pressed in on the small room, the fluorescent light flickering slightly above them. Keene said nothing more. She stood quietly, as if waiting for him to finish talking. Evans paced once, shaking his head, muttering about wasted time. He reached for his radio to call security for verification. Then, without warning, the base alarm erupted. The sound was sharp, mechanical, and absolute. Red lights began to pulse across the ceiling. And a flat, synthetic voice filled the building. Code red. Code red. Security breach detected in Data Vault Bravo. This is not a drill. Evans froze, his hands still on the radio. His face draining of color. The lights painted the walls crimson with each pulse. The distant sound of boots and shouted orders began to rise from the corridor outside. He fumbled for his radio, pressing the transmit key but speaking too fast. To be clear, his words overlapped the alarm. Half orders. Half panic. Keene didn't move at first. Her breathing slowed, her eyes shifting once toward the door. Her entire presence changed without a sound. She no longer looked like someone being interrogated. She looked like someone about to act. Evans was still yelling into his radio when she straightened, her body aligning with a quiet readiness that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with instinct. The alarm blared so loudly that the walls seemed to vibrate. Red lights pulsed against the white walls, bathing the corridor in flashes of color that felt almost alive. Captain Ryan Evans froze, his hand halfway to his radio, eyes wide as the words Code Red repeated through the speakers. The sound of running boots and shouted orders echoed down the hall, a dozen voices overlapping in confusion. The steady rhythm of military procedure had broken apart into chaos. Evans's mind raced to find the checklist for this situation, but nothing came. His voice cracked over the radio as he barked commands that made no sense. Lieutenant Sarah Keene had already shifted. Her breathing slowed. The blare of the alarm didn't rattle her. It narrowed her focus. The room, the walls, the stale air, everything became data. She turned her head once, scanning her environment with precision. One exit, one overhead vent, one observation camera. She moved to the door, her motion smooth, deliberate. Her hand reached behind her waistband, fingers finding the grip of her SIG P365XL. The draw was fluid, one motion practiced 1,000 times. Her finger stayed indexed along the frame, muzzle down, posture controlled. She eased the door open just enough to see into the corridor. The sound of boots hitting metal grating filled the air, mixed with clipped bursts of shouting and the echo of alarms bouncing off glass. She saw 3 figures moving through the red haze, dressed in black tactical gear that didn't belong to any base unit. Their formation was tight, their weapons up, movements synchronized. They weren't panicked. They were professionals. They were heading straight for the Data Vault Bravo corridor. Evans finally snapped out of his freeze. He shouted for her to stay put, to wait for orders. His voice ragged and loud. Keene didn't respond. Her eyes tracked the intruders, her body aligning with her decision before the thought even finished, forming, identify, assess, execute. That was the process. There was no time to explain or justify. She slipped into the hallway, her steps soundless against the floor, weapon steady at low ready. Her mind was quiet, her heart rate barely changed. She was not reacting to the chaos, she was cutting through it. Behind her, Evans kept shouting, trying to restore authority to a situation that had already moved beyond him. In contrast, Keene's silence spoke of something far greater than rank. It was the silence of control, the kind earned only through years of training, and the kind that, at that moment, was about to save lives. Lieutenant Sarah Keene moved through the chaos like a shadow, her senses sharpened by instinct. The flashing red lights and echo of alarms faded into background noise. Her eyes locked on 3 figures advancing toward the Data Vault Bravo corridor. They moved with practiced rhythm, one kneeling near the electronic lock, tablet in hand, while the other 2 scanned the hallway with rifles up. They were efficient. Noordbanitsted. That alone told her everything. They were trained. They knew exactly where they were going. A flicker of motion caught her eye. To her left, half concealed behind a structural pillar, a young Marine stood frozen. Private First Class Taylor, no older than 19. his M4A1 hanging loose at his chest. His breathing was erratic, shallow, the kind that comes before paralysis. Keene slid toward him, her footsteps silent against the tile. She placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Her voice was calm, measured, not loud, but commanding enough to cut through the alarm. "Move with me." The Marine's body reacted before his mind did. He nodded quickly, gripping his rifle tighter. She led him to the pillar, taking a knee beside him, her SIG P365XL steady in her hands. She peeked around the edge, reading the scene like a diagram. One operator on the lock, two providing overwatch. Range, 30 yards. Angle clear. Civilians behind cover. She turned to Taylor, speaking low, her tone even and practical. "On my signal, suppress the overwatch positions. Do not go for kills. Force them to take cover." His eyes were wide but focused. He nodded once, his finger resting along his rifle's trigger guard, waiting. Keene inhaled slowly. Her breathing fell into the rhythm drilled into her through years of DEVGRU training. The world seemed to narrow to her front sight, and the space between her heartbeat. She exhaled. One breath, one trigger press. The shot cracked like thunder. A perfect single round that struck the lock operator in the back of the helmet. The man dropped instantly, the tablet clattering to the floor. Keene's voice, calm and low, reached Taylor's ear. Now, the Marine fired. Short bursts, rounds, striking the wall behind the two Overwatch intruders. The impacts sparked concrete dust and forced them to dive for cover. Their attention shifted entirely toward him. Keene was already moving. She flowed out from behind the pillar, gliding low and fast, firing twice in quick succession. 2 rounds. Center mass. The second intruder dropped before his rifle could rise. The third turned, startled. Musleh coming up. She dropped to one knee, her front sight already aligned. One shot. His body went limp, rifle falling from his grip as he hit the floor. Silence returned as suddenly as the violence had begun. Taylor froze, his chest heaving inside his plate carrier. His ears rang. The smell of burned powder thickened the air. 7 seconds had passed. He looked toward her, barely believing what he had just seen. She stood calm, weapon low and ready, scanning the corridor for more movement. Her breathing hadn't changed. Her face was still. To him, she looked more machine than human. A presence of complete control. Keene finally looked back at him and gave a small nod. A gesture of approval, acknowledgement, and command all at once. It steadied him more than any order could. She stepped forward to clear the area, her movements clean and efficient, every motion purposeful. Behind her, the young Marine exhaled shakily, realizing he had just witnessed something that would stay with him forever. The echo of gunfire faded, leaving only the ringing in their ears and the faint hum of alarms winding down. The air hung heavy with the metallic scent of gunpowder and the sharp tang of ozone. Lieutenant Sarah Keene stood motionless in the corridor, her weapon held low and steady, her breathing even. She scanned the area once more, eyes tracking the shadows and corners with deliberate calm. Satisfied the threat was gone, she holstered her SIG P365XL and straightened. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, the way someone acts when every action is second nature. Private First Class Taylor was still frozen beside the support column, his M4A1 gripped tight in his hands. His chest rose and fell as adrenaline burned out of his system, his ears catching the soft click of Keene securing her weapon. Around them, sailors and Marines began to emerge from cover, blinking against the red light, faces pale and stunned. The chaos that had filled the hallway only moments ago had dissolved into an almost reverent silence. Taylor looked at her with disbelief. The same quiet woman who had been dismissed and mocked at the checkpoint had just moved through fire and smoke like it was routine. Then the sound of hydraulics broke the stillness as the heavy blast doors to the command center slid open. Admiral James Thorne stepped through, his stride purposeful, his presence immediately restoring order to the shaken room. 2 armed masters-at-arms flanked him, scanning the scene. But Thorne's eyes were already on Keene. He took in the 3 downed intruders, the scattered debris, and the way personnel instinctively cleared a path between them. His expression was unreadable, but his focus absolute. Keene stood at parade rest, calm and composed. When he stopped before her, he asked for a report, his voice low and controlled. She responded without hesitation. 3 hostiles neutralized. Data Vault Bravo. Secure. No friendly casualties. Her tone carried no pride, no embellishment. It was pure fact, the kind of clear, concise delivery that came from someone who had done this before. Thorne nodded once, a small gesture that carried immense weight. Behind him, Captain Ryan Evans stumbled out of the debrief room, pale and disoriented. He tried to speak, to take back control, but his voice faltered. Thorne turned his head slightly, his gaze enough to silence him completely. The difference between them was unmistakable. Evans's authority was printed on his collar. Keene's was earned in the space of 7 seconds. The admiral's nod became the quiet acknowledgement of a veteran recognizing another. Around them, the sailors saw it too, their expressions shifting from confusion to respect. In that moment, the balance of power in the entire command shifted, not through words or rank, but through competence. The silence inside the command center lobby felt heavier than the sound of the alarms that had come before. Admiral James Thorne stood still, the glow of his tablet casting a faint light on his face. The crowd of sailors and Marines formed an uneasy half-circle around him, none daring to speak. Every eye followed as he scrolled through the classified personnel file his aide had just handed him. His expression tightened, not with surprise, but with understanding. He looked up once at Lieutenant Sarah Keene, then back to the screen, and began to read aloud. "Lieutenant Sarah Keene," he said. "Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Callsign Echo. DEVGRU. SEAL Team 6. The words hung in the air like a detonation without sound. Murmurs rippled through the formation of personnel, spreading disbelief and shock. No one moved. The admiral continued reading, his tone steady but edged with reverence. Graduate of BUD divided by S-Class 323. One of the first women in U.S. history to complete the training. Qualified in Halo Freefall, Combat Diver School, and Advanced Demolition. 4 deployments in Afghanistan. 2 in Iraq. Multiple classified operations in the Horn of Africa and Southeast Asia. Each line of his voice landed like a hammer against the fragile pride of Captain Ryan Evans, who stood pale in the background. Thorne's tone never changed, but the weight of the record spoke for itself. Silver Star, Bronze Star, with Valor, Purple Heart, Presidential Unit Citation. The list seemed endless. He paused, letting the air fill with the reality of who stood before them. This woman, the one who had been dismissed as lost or naive, was one of the most decorated special operators in active service. When Thorne finished, he lowered the tablet slowly. The silence that followed was absolute. Evans's mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came. The admiral stepped forward, closing the space between them. For a long moment, he simply looked at Keene. Then he raised his right hand to his brow and held a slow, formal salute. The gesture was precise, deliberate, and deeply personal. It was not the salute of a commander to a subordinate. It was the salute of one warrior acknowledging another. Keene returned the salute, her movements exact, her face composed. Around them, no one dared to move or speak. What had begun as a confrontation ended in complete reversal. Rank had lost its meaning. The quiet professional had silenced arrogance, not with words, but with proof. The salute became the closing note of a story the entire room would remember for the rest of their careers. The days after the incident passed quietly, as if the entire base had exhaled and settled into a new rhythm. The tension that had filled the command center was replaced by quiet respect, and people spoke of Lieutenant Sarah Keene in low, measured tones. Captain Ryan Evans avoided the main corridors, his posture smaller. Now, the sharp confidence in his stride gone. He had already received the orders that would end his career, effective immediately. He was relieved of duty as base security officer and reassigned to a logistics position at Naval Support Facility Minot, North Dakota. The language in the paperwork was polite, procedural, and final. 3 days before his transfer, he sat in a classroom at the Naval War College in Newport. The walls were sterile white. The projector, humming softly as a slide, appeared on the screen. The title read, Case Study Leadership Failure and the Cost of Assumption. Gunnery Sergeant Carla Lewis stood at the front, composed and professional. Her first example was the story of a female officer who had been underestimated at a naval installation during a security breach. The story was told without names, but every detail landed like a mirror in front of Evans. Around him, younger officers listened, taking notes on humility and accountability. He sat still, eyes forward, realizing that his downfall had become a lesson miles away. Lieutenant Keene was back on the range at Coronado, standing behind a young sailor who struggled to steady his aim. Her voice was calm and patient as she corrected his stance, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She didn't speak of the incident or the legend it had become. To her, it was already past. She had work to do, and that was enough. Months had passed since the day the alarms blared and gunfire echoed through the Naval Special Warfare Command Center. The story of what happened was no longer just an incident, it had become legend. Around the base, people spoke of Lieutenant Sarah Keene in quiet, respectful tones, referring to her only by her call sign, Echo. No one embellished the details anymore. They didn't need to. The truth carried its own power. What mattered most wasn't the firefight or the medals. It was the way she had carried herself, calm, precise, professional. The culture of the command had changed. The loud swagger that once filled the halls was replaced by quiet focus. Junior officers learned to listen more, and senior leaders began valuing competence over posturing. Training drills shifted toward realism, teamwork, and decision-making under pressure. The phrase, "stay calm like Echo," had become a quiet mantra, whispered before evaluations or missions. She had never asked for it, but her name had become shorthand for the kind of excellence that couldn't be taught, only earned. One afternoon at the base firing range, Keene stood behind a young sailor struggling with his aim. The sun reflected off the line of M4A, one carbines laid out on the benches. The air smelled of gun oil and dust. The sailor fired another round, pulling the shot wide. Keene stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "Don't fight the weapon. Let it work with you. Breathe. Align. Squeeze. Don't jerk." She adjusted his shoulders slightly, guided his hands, then stepped back. The next round hit center target. He exhaled, surprised, and she gave a small nod. "That's it. The precision was already there. You just had to let it happen." Her tone was gentle, but the lesson was lasting. Elsewhere on the base, the story lived in other ways. In the mess hall, recruits whispered about her first day. In the gym, instructors referenced her during leadership briefings. The tale of Echo had become less about a single moment and more about a standard of conduct. People tried to live up to it. One morning, at the same security gate where it had all begun, a new lieutenant grew impatient with a young sailor checking his credentials. The officer demanded to be waved through. The sailor paused, calm and professional. "With all due respect, Sire, what matters here isn't who you are. It's what you can do." He smiled slightly and added, Let me tell you a story about Echo. The legend had become a lesson, passed quietly from one generation to the next. And on that base, long after the sound of alarms had faded, her influence still echoed,